Think, Mark, think. During their battle regarding Earth's fate, Omni-Man asked Invincible what he would have after 500 years, since Viltrumites live for thousands but humans do not, which is why, according to Nolan, Mark would lose everything he holds dear. However, Mark knew that he would still have his father, which is why he stayed true to himself, only for both of them to be proved wrong. Whilst Mark lost his father, he ended up marrying the perfect woman, creating a family with superpowers just like his own, and what's more, he even became the Viltrumite Emperor. This was more than he could have asked for, because throughout Mark's life, it was pretty evident that he didn't have the best of luck for anything except being the Rizzler.
Yeah, boy.
Anyway, we learn that Mark's family is the only reason he did not go berserk and turn evil in most other universes. But to know why, let's look at where it all began. Amber.
Same, but different.
As you may have noticed, Amber in the comics and the show are very different, not just in her appearance, but in her character as well. Nonetheless, Amber's bond with Invincible is the same, as she was his first girlfriend. She's an ordinary person at Mark's high school. They first met when Todd was harassing Amber as Mark intervened like an alpha, only to get thrashed. Yep, my man had to be saved by Amber landing a balls deep kick because Mark had not unlocked his superpowers yet. But this embarrassment led to Mark discovering his abilities that same evening. Well, Amber is so impressed by Mark getting beaten up, she gives her number to him, which in hindsight should have been a red flag, but Mark is just like me, alright? He had those rose-tinted glasses on. But since Mark now had his powers, he took on the identity of Invincible, which is how he came across Atom Eve. It turns out that she went to the same school too, and seeing as how Mark was a rookie to the whole saving the world business, Eve bonded with him and introduced him to the teen team. Despite Eve dating Rexplode, Mark and her became such close friends that Amber even suspected that they were dating. In fact, Mark was the first person that Eve went to when she found out that Rex was cheating on her with Kate. However, William, Mark's friend, denied that there was anything between them, which is how Mark and Amber ended up on a study date. Yep, just studying. This is how they officially got together. Whilst their relationship started on a goofy note, Mark and Amber actually grew to love each other. This was evident by how, after Nolan's apparent death, Mark's continued disappearance troubled Amber a lot. In fact, she stuck with him through Mark processing the loss of Nolan and even rushing off to his superhero activities whenever Cecil called him. It wouldn't be wrong to say that Amber was incredibly patient in this relationship, always waiting on Mark and even communicating her feelings with him. But Mark couldn't help how his life took shape either. He did, however, try his best to be with Amber, finding her before anyone else when aliens invaded the school. They even had a vulnerable moment after their date in issue 17 where Amber got a glimpse into the messy life Mark was leading. But there was something weighing down on Amber's mind. Being busy as Invincible meant that Mark was often a no-show on their dates. Anyone was bound to get suspicious eventually. However, rather than thinking that he was cheating on her, Amber thought that Mark was doing drugs. Huh? That's quite the imagination she's got there. At least she didn't pretend to know that he was a superhero and give him a hard time whilst he was rescuing lives though, right? Oh wait, yeah, that did happen in the TV show, didn't it? Anyways, the cherry on top was in issue 20, because just when Mark was consoling Amber by telling her how he'd even skip classes to spend more time with her, he disappeared. Just as deadly cyborgs attacked the place, Mark rushed off to secretly change so that Invincible could save Amber. However, this appeared as if Mark had just totally ditched her to look out for himself. Thus, Amber felt betrayed, spelling the end of their relationship. This breakup did not sit well with either of them though, as they had quite a lot of feelings for each other, which is why Mark made the move and decided to come clean. Right after her classes, Mark found a way into Amber's bedroom from the window. Yeah, no, you're right. This is creepy. Do not try this at home, or anybody's home for that matter, please. In fact, let's just swiftly move on, because Amber doesn't buy this trap either. However, as Mark begins explaining, Cecil interrupts again. And this is where show Amber and comic Amber become hella different. Whilst comic Amber called a friend over to discuss her relationship issues, only to end up with the possibility that Mark might be a superhero, this bitch figured it out all alone. Yep, she knew that Mark was a superhero, which means that she could have just confronted him about it, or even if she wanted to wait for him to spill the beans on his own terms, she could have at least been a bit more understanding. Either way, Mark came back to Amber's room and confessed his identity, making her the first person Mark voluntarily disclosed being invincible to, with Amber gladly accepting this part with it. It's better than being a drug dealer after all, I guess. Now, there's nothing quite like knowing your boyfriend is a superhero, right? Which is why they smash. With his identity known to Amber, Mark made sure to keep her informed of his whereabouts so that she could rest assured. However, this wasn't enough, because the world would just keep falling apart every day, and that meant that Mark had to prioritize it over Amber. This hurt her because even if she accepted Mark's role, she couldn't fully understand how difficult it was for him to choose between the world and his love life. Even when Mark took her out to Eve's house in Africa for a trip, having a great time together, she realized that it all had to remain a secret. If she told anyone, then they would just question how they got there, etc. Clearly, this kind of secrecy and lack of prioritizing was not Amber's cup of tea, and it only got worse when Mark was forced to leave her with Eve in order to go and rescue his mother and younger brother Oliver from Angstrom's attack. Now, it may not have been this event that became a death sentence for their relationship, but it sure was a catalyst. Whilst it was supposed to be an easy job for Mark, his nemesis possessed the knowledge of the multiverse and sent him to a bunch of them before leaving him stranded in a desert. With all of Mark's absences, Amber would often find herself alone and eventually came across another guy at her college called Gary, and they later met for a study session.
Pause.
No, not the same kind that she had with Mark. In fact, Amber was just friends with Gary while she still stayed very patient and loyal whenever Mark wasn't with her, never even thinking of cheating on him. Oh yeah, Mark really scored with her. But one thing that was starkly different between them was that despite having important and urgent matters to deal with, Gary always placed Amber first. Listen, alright, telling your boss that he can't cover for a shift isn't even as remotely urgent as saving the world, but whatever, I guess. Needless to say, this pulled at her heartstrings, and even though she wanted to be with Mark, they both had different expectations from their love life. And if their relationship wasn't rocky enough as it is, Eve entered the chat. You see, Mark and her always had a little bit of a will they, won't they kind of vibe to them. But the entire dynamic of their relationship changed when Mark was rescued from the desert dimension that Angstrom sent him to. Whilst Mark was only in this world for about an hour after killing Angstrom, the team that came to save him included a future Eve for whom 15 years had passed. Before sending him back to his own world and timeline, Eve revealed to Mark that she had always loved him and was devastated when he disappeared. Mark was unsure what to do in this situation. However, back in his own timeline, upon visiting Eve, they briefly kissed. However, as Mark was already in a relationship, they realized that this wasn't right. Luckily though, with Gary entering Amber's life, Mark has the excuse to end things with her. Mark decided that it wasn't fair to keep her constantly waiting for him when she could have been happy with someone else, so ultimately they break up after one final cuddle. Though this was the last time that Amber was important in Mark's life, Invincible still had one last role to play. As much later, in issue 56, when he finds out that Gary had been beating her, he goes and put the fear of God into him to make sure that he never does anything like that ever again. Regardless, when Eve finds out that Mark and Amber had broken up, she barges into his dorm room and makes her move. However, Mark fumbles it all as he tells her about everything the future version of herself said, causing the current Eve to think that he's doing all of this just because he feels sorry for her, and so she just storms out. Eventually, there is an emergency that ends up pulling both Mark and Eve together on a mission. Mark tells her that when he was on the verge of dying, he kept having these thoughts bubbling up in his mind that cut through the chaos. Small moments where all he could think about was her. The sound of her voice, the way she smells, her smile. As he was gonna die, she was the only thing on his mind. And with that, she kisses him and they are officially together. Seriously, you guys better be taking notes. This is some real shit. This relationship very quickly starts off on the opposite foot from Mark and Amber's. Just as Amber was surprised when Gary chose to stay with her instead of leaving, Mark is equally put off balance when Eve immediately understands all the craziness involved with his superhero life. As she puts it, "I'm not some stupid girl you have to bend over backwards to keep happy. I'm some freaking Eve. I know what you're going through."
Are you sure about that?
You see, a huge theme of their relationship going forward would be Mark not being there for Eve and how that stresses their relationship relationship again. For example, they go to Paris for their first real date, and Mark promises that Cecil will not interrupt him. And it's almost exactly that moment that he says this that a portal opens up next to them with two dudes from the future begging him to come and save their timeline. And sure, because of time travel, Mark is able to return literally the next second, but that's pretty much the pattern going forward. Mark promises to be there and then makes some choice that makes him not there. That said, the rest of their date is a banger. From flying around the Eiffel Tower, to a gondola ride in Venice, chilling with polar bears on the ice caps, smooching on the Great Sphinx, sitting over the Sydney Opera House and overlooking the world in space. My guy set the bar quite literally out of this world, leading to some very super-powered sexy time when they get back to his place. Now, the next big step of their relationship would be trying to get a place together. However, as they were broke, they couldn't afford land for Eve to build a house on. Now, I'm gonna call BS here. It's only this expensive because they're trying to live in a city. But in Mark's case especially, he can literally fly around the world in a matter of seconds. So like, just build a house anywhere? I don't know. What do I know?
He's got a point.
What they end up deciding to do instead is setting up Invincible Inc., a private security company where businesses or prisons could hire Mark for protection in case of emergency. This becomes a bit weird very quickly when he is called to a disaster site and finds an alternate version of himself destroying the city. This is caused by the return of Angstrom, and in the attack, Eve is hospitalized. Luckily, she makes a pretty quick recovery, and by the time Conquest shows up, she is ready to help Mark fight. Now, unfortunately, choosing to help Mark fight here is dumb as hell, and she is killed almost immediately, only for the writers to go as Eve just rebuilds her body after dying and makes an opening for Mark to ultimately win the fight, even making some improvements in doing so. In all the conflict though, Eve's ex-boyfriend Rex is killed. She gives a speech at his funeral that ends up leaving her feeling conflicted and guilty. She thinks that it's wrong to be sad because she loved Rex while she was dating Mark, but he is totally unbothered by any of that and just happy that she is alive and sympathizes with her. The relationship takes another big step forward when Eve has Mark over to meet her parents, and this very quickly turns into a dumpster fire. Following a very awkward silence, Eve's mom asks what Mark's father does, even though she knows he is the son of Omni-Man. This leads Eve's dad to reveal his aggressive nature by calling his wife stupid for bringing up such a sensitive subject. And let's be clear, alright, Eve's dad is just the worst. After making a scene about being allowed to talk to his wife however he wants to in his own house, he gives Mark a speech about his little angel. You know, you'd think this would usually be, treat my daughter well, you better not break my daughter's heart, you know, all that great fatherly talk. Yeah, no. He starts thanking Mark for giving his daughter a chance despite knowing she slept with Rex before because he knows she's now dirty.
Huh?
No, like, seriously, it's just a whole page of this dude talking about how important virginity is and how gross it is to get sloppy seconds, and I'm pretty sure Mark's face says it all. Things soon take a dramatic turn, though, when Eve's powers start acting up, and we find out that she is pregnant. Though she is clearly very upset about this, as we see her crying in the bathroom. Sure, the pregnancy was making her powers act weird, but more importantly, this meant that she was bringing another Viltrimite into the world, and if Mark is the exception to them all being monsters, this could end very, very badly. That said, she doesn't tell Mark about it, and at first it leads to a little bit of tension in their relationship. For example, as Mark is preparing to head into space in issue 71, he asks Eve if she has found more heroes to work for Invincible Inc., causing her to snap at it, as she has had a lot on her mind and hasn't been able to get to that yet. Mark, however, has no idea what exactly is on her mind because she isn't talking to him about it, but she's still getting angry with him for acting like things are normal, as if mind reading has just suddenly been added to his list of superpowers. Honestly, Yusuf, save me before this toxic ass relationship gets me cancelled.
Don't worry, Harrison, I got you. Because what happens next only makes matters worse. As Mark leaves to fight in the Viltrumite War, we see him apologizing to Eve, stating that he doesn't know when or if he will be coming back, following the tradition of Mark not being there when his girl really needs him. By the time Mark does come back, But just 10 months later, Eve has gained a lot of weight from both stress and the pregnancy. And if you're wondering where the baby is, well, we'll get to that in a bit. As Eve is incredibly self-conscious to the point of not even wanting Mark to see her at first, but very happy to embrace him once they are together. Eve tells Mark how she fell into depression whilst he was gone, not seeing the point of moving on with her life because she believed Mark was dead. However, at the very least, her powers are back to normal. That said, we finally get to see them doing normal couple stuff for really the first time as they go to visit Kate and the immortal who now have kids together. Where a big takeaway from this dinner together is Eve seeing these two kids and becoming very emotional. When she steps outside and talks to Mark, we finally get the full picture as she explains that whilst he was gone, she had an abortion. Eve earlier had decided not to disclose her pregnancy in fear that Mark might not go fight the Viltrumites on Telescria if he knew she was having a baby. Though I'm pretty sure Mark would have still gone to save their unborn child from the imminent threat of Thrag, along with having a boost in power due to the emotions that would accompany it, which we do see later on. Regardless, the lack of communication forced Eve to make the decision to abort their child alone, as she didn't know if Mark was coming back, and she believed that she couldn't be a parent on her own. It's actually a very sad moment where she pleads for Mark's forgiveness, with him apologizing for not being there for her. There is some good news though, as when they return home, they learn that Nolan and Debbie are going to move to Telescria, which means that Mark and Eve will be getting their house. Yep, they ain't homeless anymore. However, as with all relationships, things soon enter a bit of a rough patch, with Mark entering his Deku stage, trying to change and work with the villains instead of beating them. This causes Eve to feel out of the loop with his poor life choices, which ends up killing billions. And to top things off, Mark is infected by the Scourge virus, and whilst he is out of commission, Bulletproof takes over his role in Invincible Inc. and then also tries to take over his role in the bedroom. What? Wait, that's kind of mad, you know. What that to me? But good girl Eve rejects him. This showcases that even with all of the shit that they went through, Eve is still ever so loyal. Eventually, when Eve goes to save Mark, we learn that the Scourge virus turned off his powers. But by going balls deep in Eve, they start to return. This ends up with Eve once again being pregnant. And much like before, this resulted in her being unable to use her powers safely, as you know, it would risk the life of her baby. Yeah, that being said, she soon makes an exception when Mark goes out of his way to propose. That's right, she makes a ring for herself, leading to the two getting engaged. However, if Eve was already Mark's greatest weakness as his girlfriend, things would only get worse now that she's his pregnant wife-to-be with no powers. And when Angstrom Levy returns, he takes full advantage of that. Luckily, Eve is able to talk to Angstrom with some talk no jutsu, reminding him of his original goal to help people. He realizes that killing Mark would do nothing to help him, and so revenge is pointless. Thus, Angstrom releases Mark and surrenders, only for a parallel Mark with a mohawk to take him to his home dimension. This, however, turns Mark into the obsessive one. He becomes hell-bent on finding and killing Angstrom to ensure that he can never come after his family again. After all, this was his third attempt. Regardless, Eve sees this obsession as a distraction from her and their baby, begging Mark to calm down. And he agrees. Soon after this, Mark talks to Nolan about being a father and if he was scared too when he found out Debbie was pregnant. To this, Nolan basically says that he has been scared every day since Mark was born because he now has something to lose, and Mark Mark really seems to worry about this. Even more stress is added to Mark's life in issue 107 when one of the Viltrumites, Anissa, takes an interest in him and kisses him after stopping a lava monster, something he hides from Eve. Instead, he chooses to double down on his focus towards Angstrom, and again Eve begs him not to turn into the evil he is trying to defeat. This is the same time that Robot manages to find which dimension Angstrom has been taken to and calls Mark to let him know that he is ready. When they arrive at the lab, Eve begs Mark one more time not to go through with this, but he demands she gives up on stopping him. She mentions that she is worried about the other dimension because Robot and Monster Girl got locked in the Flaxen world for nearly a year, and she feels like this could be even worse. It devolves into a screaming match where Eve is afraid to lose her family over something that might not matter, whilst Mark is so terrified of that family being put in jeopardy that he can't see anything but the possible dangers around him, which needs to be removed. They both have a point, but it turns out Eve was right, because when they arrive in the other dimension, they find Angstrom has been chained up and tortured by the alternate evil Mark, who invades other multiverses to expand his empire. However, it isn't Angstrom or evil Mark who attacks Invincible. Instead, it is Robot. Yep, he was evil all along. Everything was a lie because Robot wants to take over the world himself. He abandons Mark there after seeing the empire evil Mark has made, worried that our Mark might do the same. It would be 6 months before he returned home when we learned this evil conniving Robot told Eve that Mark had died. Whilst he had been gone, she had been so distressed that she stopped eating and almost lost the baby. She was even hospitalized for a month. This trauma pushed Eve through her breaking point, where she concluded that the best thing for her and her child is to leave Mark. Now, I know this sounds absolutely contradictory. First, she aborts the baby because Mark isn't there, and she doesn't want to be a single mother because she can't support and doesn't believe that she can be a single mother. And now Mark is actually here. She chooses to be a single mother. Oh, wait. I was supposed to defend her, right? Okay, people evolve and they change over time. And now she's more mature, where she believes that Mark chose to go into the portal, and his active decision, even working with the villains in Dinosaurus, is what was screwing up. So she ends up kicking him out of his own house. Yep, the same house that he was raised in. However, Mark's life was about to get even worse, because remember that female Viltrumite that had the eyes on Mark, that kissed him and liked him? She wanted him, she gotta have him. So as per Viltrumite tradition, she finds him and forces herself onto Mark in order to birth a powerful Viltrumite offspring. To put it lightly, this is a tough time for Mark. Things, however, does start to get slightly better as Mark's relationship with Eve finally starts to reopen when her leg is ripped off by Robot, who has gone completely insane. He takes her to the doctors on the moon and baby Terra is born. Seeing their daughter, Eve welcomes Mark back into her life. However, with Robot successfully taking over the world, Mark and Eve have to abandon Earth and live on Telescria. Their relationship blooms. However, when Eve feels ready to get some, Mark's trauma resurfaces and he pushes her off him. That said, he does finally open up and tells Eve all about Anissa. At first, Mark says he blames himself because he doesn't think he fought back as hard as he should have. But Eve soon realizes that's crazy and that he shouldn't feel guilty at all. With their relationship finally getting back to normal, it was about time a spanner was thrown into the mix. A Thrag-shaped one, to be precise. The now former Viltrumite Emperor had been found, and it was Mark who had to go finish him off. Eventually, this leads to Mark being sent back in time to the day he first got his powers. However, upon realizing that in this timeline, Eve and Rex are still a thing, he opts to return back to his fiancée and daughter. Unfortunately though, by the time he returns in issue 126, 5 years has passed. Yep, this guy cannot catch a break. There is a very tear-filled reunion with his wife and daughter, and slowly Eve tries to welcome him back into her life again. However, he had left her waiting for him. Who within those 5 years had to start moving on with her life. She even started to date other men, which only ended very recently. This causes Eve to take it really slow with their relationship, where she rather sleeps on a bench than with Mark in the same bed. But Mark is Mark, so Eve warms up to him pretty quickly. Eventually, Mark and Eve go visit his parents on the moon. However, there's an interaction with Anissa here, where Eve straight up tries to murder her for what she did to Mark. He literally has to hold her back to stop her, showing that Eve still cares for Mark and loves him. And it's a good thing he does stop her, because it turns out Anissa had Mark's child after their encounter. Once they return home, they don't get much alone time as Thrag and his kids come and absolutely dominate them. Mark's brother Oliver is killed, with him and Eve only surviving because her powers kick in at the last second to rebuild their bodies. Whilst this is absolutely terrifying, it does function as a way to put Mark and Eve on the same page when it comes to joining the war effort and stopping Thrag. It is at Oliver's funeral though that Eve finally gets all the things she needs off her chest when Alan and Mark starts fighting. Mark says he's sorry for fighting, he got angry and lost control, but Eve cuts him off and says he decided to do something stupid without thinking about the consequence, which is what he always does. At this point, she has spent more of their relationship waiting for him than actually being with him. However, this time she at least understands and agrees that they have to go after Thrag. But if they are going to risk their lives, they should at least get married first. And in issue 133, they finally do that. With that though, we can more or less move into the final battle. Of course, Mark is more involved in the important fights, but Eve is on the battlefield as well. But when Eve is almost killed by a space dinosaur, it is Anissa who sacrifices her life to save her. Gosh, this is sad. Anissa uses the last of her life to tell Eve that she and Mark did have a child together, and says she is sorry for hurting Mark, but she does not regret it because it led to her son being born. Ultimately, Thrag and his empire are defeated, but not without the heartbreaking loss of Mark's father, Nolan. Thus, after the war, Mark is made Emperor of the Viltrumites and continues his dad's journey of spreading peace across the galaxy and frees every planet he can find, with Eve as his Empress. They would stay together for another 70 or so years until Eve passed away, only to be rebuilt with her powers in the next moment as a young strapping 30-year-old woman. With that, we have two nearly immortal people who get to live out the rest of their lives together in a universe that only knows peace. And so, whilst Mark may not have his dad after 500 years, he instead has a loving family free of worries. If you guys enjoyed that, make sure to hit the like button, ding the notification bell, and if you want to learn more about Mark's brother, then check this video out next.